businesses created a large part of the city's wealth. So we came up with this map of what we think is a proposed landmark district. The Commission on Chicago Landmarks has started the landmark designation process for this area in April. And what we're looking at is about 46 acres, primarily on Fulton and Randolph Streets, with a connector between the two on Sangamon. We have there about 88 historic buildings constructed between the 1880s and the 1920s. And for food distribution and manufacturing, as well as for industrial uses. So the landmark designation process is underway. And right now we're in the phase of the process where we've asked the owners of those properties to consent to designation. Now, my colleagues thought this was a bit of a reach, but my point with this slide was not to compare Fulton Randolph with Covent Garden or anything like that, but was to point out that every city relies on external producers of food to survive. So it's a basic urban concept. And they also need a place, a marketplace, to bring that food in, to channelize it and distribute it to consumers in the city. Chicago is no different. Early in the city's history, when the city was just 15 years old in a town, they built this market hall on State Street between Lake and Randolph, right in the middle of the street. The first floor contained 32 stalls where food was sold to city residents, and the upper floors were basically the city's first purpose-built city hall. This kind of combination of market and government building was something that was found in the colonies, and it was something that also was found in Northern Europe in previous centuries. So as the city kept expanding, that one market on State Street soon grew inadequate for the number of people living here. So in 1850, the city widened a section of Randolph Street at Des Plaines and built a market hall right in the middle of the street. And you can see from the map from 1860s where the building was there. And then the lower image is from a kind of a lithograph from 1857 that gives us a very rough idea of what that building might have looked like. Probably designed by John Mill Van Osdol. It looks like it's probably 2 stories. It looks like there's a bell tower. Aside from that, we really don't know what it looked like. But this market hall from 1850 is important because it established a food marketing district in this part of the city that continues to some degree today. And that's 164 years later. Besides the Loop, I can think of no other part of the city that has that kind of long tradition of continuous function. So when the market hall was built, Chicago was well on its way to becoming the nation's food capital. And the reasons for this were explored by William Cronin in his environmental history of the city. It's basically geography. We were surrounded by a vast agricultural region that was rich in producing produce and livestock. And on the other hand, we were at the center of rail and lake transportation networks that made it natural for all that stuff from the Midwest and farther west to pour into Chicago. All of that food, livestock included, required markets for distribution. How do you get these massive amounts of like a carload, a train carload of apples? How do you break that down so that somebody at a grocery store can buy 6? And that's where you need wholesale markets. And these were really important in the city's economy and history. So we have the old Southwater Market, which probably predated Fulton Randolph. That was where Wacker Drive is now, and that was closed in 1923. Of course, we had the Maxwell Street Market, which sold not just food, but pretty much everything, and that was closed in the 1990s. Union Stockyards was basically a wholesale clearinghouse for livestock, closed in 1971. New Southwater Market is still there, but closed as a market in 2003. My point in showing this is that of all the wholesale food markets in Chicago, Fulton Randolph's the only one that survives and the only one that continues to function. So at some point around 1880, the Market Hall building that the city built in the middle of Randolph Street was demolished. I can't figure out why. There's some hints that there was corruption or what have you. But anyways, the market hall went away. The demand for produce in that neighborhood did not go away. So what the city did is establish basically a farmer's market called the West Randolph Street Public Market. And what this was is the city ran it, they charged fees, they had regulations for hours of operation and other things. But what it was basically a farmer's market that was year-round. It was in the middle of Randolph Street where that market hall used to be. And it was something that the hustle and bustle of this market and the other ones in Chicago exercised a certain fascination on residents and tourists. And you can see this view of Randolph in 1890, just the level of traffic and congestion. And think of this as all of these vendors are going to be immigrants, Dutch, German, Scandinavian mostly. So I found this quote from Brand McNally Guide to the City for Tourists, who in 1896 said this place is one of the old landmarks of the city. The city and country meet day by day, and the everlasting crash of separate interests is a place like this that the student of human nature will find an inexhaustible fund of amusement and instruction. They don't write travel books like that anymore. So the people that worked at this market were actually known as truck farmers, and that term truck farm is kind of archaic. It came about well before the use of motor trucks. And what it refers to is the fact that they would grow produce on small farms, and they would then truck it into the city on a wagon. Most of these were immigrants. They worked in generally small farms, places like Roseland. That is named because it was basically the truck farmers who did the city's flower market. The slide shows the Lyman Budlong Farm, which was probably one of the largest in the city. It was 700 acres. And it says in the Tribune that it was the largest pickle farm in the world. I don't know, I haven't researched that. But you could see the imagery and the life of the truck farmer. It was something that fascinated people. And it comes up again in literature. We've got George Ade wrote a short story about the truck farmers and the market on Randolph. So did Edna Ferber. She talks about a single mother who worked at the market. And then interesting, I found this image on the right from the Chicago Magazine, that the market was continuing to function well up to 1955. And in fact, the city didn't close it until 1963. By that time, the amount of arable land that was close enough to the city to bring it in, it just didn't make sense. So the truck farmer market at its peak housed between 400 and 700 truck farmers, and we've seen that it was crowded already. In 1908, the city decided to expand the widened section of Randolph Street to the west, to Sangamon. And the purpose of this was really to relieve overcrowding for the farmers market, but it also eliminated a vice district known as Dopetown, which was west of the old market. And we tend to think of drugs and that kind of thing as a contemporary problem, but it was really a historic problem in Chicago. This is where you would go to buy cocaine and morphine from drugstores illegally. So really what this shows is, the quote in the paper said, this is, removing these old, sagging, desolate shacks will be in line with the dreams of a Chicago beautiful. So it really plays into this planning concept in Chicago and elsewhere, that planning could eliminate social problems and as well improve social conditions by providing a better market in terms of food for people in the city. So it really reflects those planning concerns in 1908. So up to now, we've been talking about a hall building that is no longer there. We've been talking about a farmer's market in the middle of Randolph Street, which is no longer there, but you can read its presence in the widened section of the street. But I wanted to get now into some of the architecture related to the food marketing on Randolph. And what we have here are commission houses. And this part of Randolph Street, after 1908, after that expansion, became known as Commission Row. These were produce wholesale dealers known as commission merchants. They set up buildings on either side of Randolph Street facing this farm market. The majority of the historic buildings on Randolph, a lot of those restaurant row, that was known as Commission Row initially. And they were built primarily around that 1908 widening campaign. And again, there was a second widening campaign in 1923 where we see another kind of spurt of growth in commission house construction. You know, I've been working in preservation in Chicago for a long time, and I, do building permit research here, and it says the building type, com house, and I didn't know what that was, and what it turns out is the building type is for commission house, and this is something that was well known to people in the past. It's one of those building types that's kind of been lost to time. So I just wanted to show you that some things emerge in research that are really very interesting. Now the buildings themselves, a few more examples from that 1908 campaign, they're pretty vernacular. What you see is they're modular, they're boxy, they tend to be 2 stories. You very often see awnings over the street, over the sidewalk. Characteristics are punched windows on the 2nd story, with what would originally been a large opening at the ground floor for admitting carriages and later trucks into the building for unloading and loading produce. Some features that are historic and still survive for this building type are the upper image shows this kind of arrangement of carriage doors that can be folded open to full width, transom windows above those to admit light when the doors were closed. We've got the raised sidewalk there, which would have met the height of a wagon or truck to ease in unloading. We also see this example below of the sidewalk canopies, something that you really don't see anywhere else in the district, in the city. So some of these commission houses were built by the actual merchant, and some of them were built by speculators who then rented them out to a number of merchants. So this particular row, 851, West Randolph, was a pretty long row of commission houses. And you can see by the tenants here in 1928 and 29 that this really reflects this notion that this was really an immigrant ethnic market. It was primarily Greek, Italian, and Jewish merchants, and as well as their customers. And that reflected basically the surrounding geography. It tended to be, when you started to see grocery stores come online in the 30s, chain grocery stores, those stores wouldn't go into ethnic neighborhoods like that. So that kind of helped this market stay in business, whereas other people were moving on to grocery stores, like chain stores. I've kind of presented commission houses to you as a small building type because they dealt with, most of them dealt with fresh produce. Now, a few of these commission agents, they dealt with non-perishable goods like coffee, spices, canned goods. So these guys could carry quite a large inventory, and they could build much larger commission houses. So 2 are shown here. We've got, these are some of the larger buildings in the district. They don't look like your average commission house, but they're important. So I talked earlier about South Water, and the plan of Chicago basically called for the removal of South Water and then replacing that with a double-decked Wacker Drive. And the point of that was the market was so congested that it was widely believed that it was increasing food costs for Chicago consumers. The other thing was that the presence of the market there was really constricting growth of the central business district. So it was a controversial proposal. The merchants at South Water were against it, so it took some time until basically 1923 when South Water was finally closed. So the merchants at South Water were split on where to go. Some of them wanted to go to a new South Water Market, which they were building at 15th and Morgan, which is in the lower photograph. That offered better facilities, and it tended to attract the commission merchants who were doing large volumes. It was closer to rail transport, and in that sense it was convenient to the guys that were dealing in large volumes. Another group went to West Randolph Street to Commission Row, and these guys were kind of the small dealers that sold basically to loop hotels, restaurants, institutions. So it maintained that proximity to the loop, as well as these guys tended to deal in much smaller quantities. They didn't need the larger facilities at the new South Water Market. So when South Water was closed in 1923, Randolph Street was expanded again in a bid to attract these displaced merchants to Randolph Street. And this extension basically went from Sangamon all the way west to Union Park. So it was a major city planning move, and you could basically see it was an indirect effect of the plan of Chicago. That 1923 expansion led to a second wave of commission house building. Here are some examples. You can see by this time they're applying some historical styles of architecture. The buildings are a little bit ornate, but still it's a basic function is there. So you've got the large openings at street level, windows on the second floor. It's a fairly simple building type. So we've been talking about produce, which tended to be focused on Randolph Street, and I wanted to switch our focus now to the meatpacking component of this area's history. So in 1833, we sent our first shipment of beef to the East Coast. That's the year the city was founded, and that really portended that this was going to be a big industry in the city. This is a good quote from the Atlantic in 1867, by which farmers realized, you can grow a lot of grain and corn and ship it to the city, to the corn exchanges, or you can feed all that stuff into a cow or a pig and have the pig walk itself there. So the quote goes, "What is a hog but 15 or 20 bushels of corn on 4 legs?" So it's funny, but it's important because that's part of the reason why Chicago became a center for meatpacking. So the flow of livestock into the city led to the establishment of the stockyards in 1865. That basically applied industrial methods to the slaughtering and packing of livestock, which was very successful. Later, the refrigerated rail and ships were perfected in 1878, and that was interesting because it opened up Chicago's meat markets to the East Coast, and that was really important in making us the national leader in meat packing. So in addition to the Union stockyards, there was another concentration of wholesale meatpacking, poultry, and egg companies on Kinsey Street as early as 1864. This group in 1887 comprised 22 meat packers, and they were basically displaced from their first location. And what they decided to do was form an association, buy land on Fulton Market Street, and build basically a new meat packing facility for all of their firms. And this is what they built. It was featured in the Chicago Inter-Ocean in 1887 as a 2-story building. These buildings are still there, except a 3rd story has been added to them. So just as Randolph Street was attractive in terms of the hustle and bustle of the market, so too was Fulton. Here's a quote from the Chicago Inter-Ocean, which shows the buildings and talks about the Fulton Market being the great emporium of meat in Chicago, which it became. Here are the buildings today. Like I said, a 3rd story was added. These were designed by William Strippelman. He was an architect trained in Germany. They are a good example of the round arch style, which was what he would have learned in Germany. And it's very closely akin to our Romanesque revival. Part of why these buildings are important is that the three big packers, Philip Armour, Gustavus Swift, and Nelson Morris, they were the big three packers in Chicago, and basically they were global brand names. They were supplying canned meat to Europe for all the colonial campaigns, for the military campaigns. These guys grew extremely wealthy, and they were all based in these stockyards. But what's important here is they also maintained branch houses in this building. So I think that though the presence of these guys in the district really adds a lot of significance, because none of their buildings, as far as I can tell, survived a Union stockyards. Soon, other meatpacking companies followed the lead of the Fulton Market Company. So this is the Wolf, Sayer, and Heller Company at 310 North Peoria from 1893, attributed to Adler and Sullivan. Richard Nichols' photo is on the lower right there, and that's clearly better than mine because it shows how Sullivan really articulated structure so well on a basic, meatpacking building. Very clear. The Agar Packing Company, 310 North Green from 1904. We don't know who the architect is. This building is currently being rehabbed. Vett and Zunker Packing Company, 210 North Green, also from 1904 by Huell and Schmid, also being renovated at this time. Chicago Butchers and Packing Company, 214 North Peoria from 1894, still working as a packing plant. That's 120 years of use. And that says a lot about that building. That's a rough industry. And then we have this gem, Richter's Food Products Company, 1032 West Randolph, 1931 by Peter Henshin, who basically specialized in meatpacking companies. This was the last, given the onset of the Depression, this was the last kind of historic building that built in the district. But the buildings that were there, the historic buildings that were there, continued to be used and adapted, and some of those adaptations, as we'll see, are important to what's there now. So I wanted to move on now to our third context. We've talked about produce on Randolph, we've talked about meatpacking. Now I want to talk about the influx of manufacturing and warehousing into the district. This was part of a larger development of industry on the Near West Side after the turn of the 20th century. Part of it was a push. A lot of the industrial areas had been built out, and part of it was a pull. There was the opening of the Northwestern Railroad Terminal in 1911 that made this area very attractive. The terminal was a half-mile east from the proposed district, and most of Chicago's working class population lived in the Near West Side, so that made it also attractive. You've got your labor force close by. So a lot of the industries that came here were food related and would have been symbiotic with the farmers market and the meatpacking companies. Just some examples, we've got Illinois Milk Condensing Company from 1893. That was later operated by Borden. Edward Katzger and Company. Who remembers Echo Kitchen Products? This is where they started. Edward Katzger's Echo. Did kitchen supplies for a lot of the bakeries in the area. Arthur Harrison Company, the bottom photo, they made stills and canning equipment, a natural fit for the food industry. They're still there. They're still in business in that location, 100 years old. Some other examples, the Kennedy Nabisco Bakery at 1001 West Randolph. That building also fronts on Washington Boulevard. It's a huge bakery complex. We have a vinegar and compressed yeast company on the bottom, and the Ives Globe Soap Works at 166 North Sangamon. Obviously there, the advantage is you have all of the fats that were coming from meatpacking plants that could be rendered into soap. There were also non-food related companies here. Wilson Brothers Drum Company became the leading supplier of drums, leading manufacturer of drums and bugle equipment, basically because they supplied our allies in World War I. Morgan Wright Tire Company, they specialized in bicycle tires, and when the automobile took off, they moved to Detroit, and they eventually became Unibroil Tire. On the bottom, we have Foot Brothers Gear and Machine Company. I believe they're still in business in some way with wind turbines, but one of their buildings is decorated with a gear. There were a few of these buildings were speculative, and they were designed for maximum flexibility in the sense that they can house multiple tenants who are either doing manufacturing or warehousing, and here are some examples. David Rankin Building is probably one of the more exceptional buildings out here. It's listed on the National Register already. The two on the bottom and to the right are by Froman and Jepson. You guys might recall that they have some landmark Schlitz tide houses in the city. But really interesting too, the photo on the right with the bridge connecting those. That's something I have not seen anywhere else in the city. So when we do landmark districts, we talk a lot about styles. It helps us organize things, and especially in residential districts in Chicago, you might have 10 architectural styles represented, and helps you kind of get a sense of when it was built, how it's important. It's an analytical tool. In some industrial districts, style is less useful as a sorter. We do have some good examples of style here, but they're not dominant. We've got the Romanesque Revival at the Fulton Market Meat Company, the Art Deco that we've seen at the sausage plant, Chicago School at the tire company, and Tudor Revival applied to that commission house. So I could say those are fairly good examples of architectural style, but most of the buildings don't reflect a style very well. There might be stuff like this that are stylistic references that are applied to basically a commercial or mercantile building. You see these horizontal pier, horizontal lines at that capitol, that pendant on the right, all clearly derived from Prairie School. We've got that classical revival base at the Grossfield and Rowe Company building on the lower left. And we've got the shaped parapet at a commission house, which to me looks like the mission style of architecture. So they're just little references. The buildings aren't those styles, but those are just references applied to them to make them familiar. What they did really well was using brick. So the buildings we know the buildings are made of brick, and architects could have built a brick box and walked away. And that's what we do today for industrial buildings. Back then, we talk about in preservation for what's appropriate. But back then, that wasn't appropriate to guys that were running industries in these buildings and their architects. So we see these kind of effects. Upper left is you have this row of headers that are pulled out from the wall to create a strip frame. That's a motif that's been identified by Dr. Westfall at Notre Dame. Top right in the middle, we've got that window that's kind of deeply reset into the wall, and that shows you how thick the wall is, and that's important. It shows you how sturdy the building is. Obviously, you've got the very nice Terrell in the corner of the building. We've got lower left recessed headers to create rustication, to kind of imitate stone. A very nice corbelled cornice on the middle bottom, and fantastic Roman brick, lower right, with a checkerboard bond pattern. This type of brickwork is something that we can't do today, and it's exceptionally high quality. So while there might not be great examples of historic styles, I would say the district has what I call a utilitarian aesthetic. And what that asks is how well does the building function for its industrial meat packing or whatever use? How sturdy is it built? How little is wasted in material or space? And how well does it express its strength or structure? And I think these two show that very well. There's some streetscape features that we think are important and worth preserving in Fulton Randolph, and they're going to be a challenge for ADA and other issues. We've got a lot of raised sidewalks that serve as loading docks. We have also the inverse, where there is no curb separation between the sidewalk and the street. These are important. They're historic functions of the district. They should be preserved. The challenge is obviously ADA and safety. We've got a lot of Belgian brick or Belgian block paved alleys. Small sections of these probably aren't important because you find them elsewhere in the city, but we find long, long runs of them in Fulton Randolph. We should consider those for preservation. And then we have upper right the canopies that we don't see, as far as I know, anywhere else in the city of Chicago. This one's not historic, but there are historic examples, and we think those are things that should be preserved. Now, Fulton Randolph, the businesses that operated here, they operated for a very long time in a very competitive environment with very, very thin profit margins. And these were hard-working buildings. I don't think anyone anticipated that these would be considered Chicago landmarks. What's happened is that a lot of these buildings have been changed in ways that might not make sense in other landmark districts, but we think the changes here kind of help tell the story of how the buildings have evolved. What we see a lot is the photo here, in between those cast iron columns, that would have been basically a complete carriageway opening so that a carriage or truck could go into that building. Around 1930, 1940s, we started to get into using forklifts, and that meant that the truck didn't need, or the wagon and the horse didn't need to go inside. That was a good thing. It also meant you didn't need that large carriage door opening on the front of your building, which was letting out all your refrigeration and letting rats in. So basically they block these up and just use a very small opening to admit the forklift coming in and out. Now, it's a change that occurred in the mid-20th century. This is something that tells the story of the building. It's part of its history. It's part of how many of these buildings function now. And when we approach permit review for changes to a building like this, this is not a place where we're going to tell a meat packer, hey, if you change this opening, you need to go back to a full door and transom windows, all of that. We say if they need to do work here, it's okay to keep it like that. So we're trying to offer flexibility. You can see too that the upper floor windows have been, in very many cases, have been blocked up. Here's a good example. I mean, this is really about technology, right? When these buildings were built, they needed the windows for light and ventilation. When we came in after the war with fluorescent lighting, it didn't generate a lot of heat, it was effective, so it's not going to heat up your refrigerated room. And you came up with artificial heating and cooling systems that were more effective, so you didn't need the windows. And so a lot of these windows have been blocked up. Easily, you could see how this could be reversed. You can see where the original window openings are. But again, we're not saying that this needs to go away at this time. If somebody wants to bring it back, fine. But it's not something that if this owner needed to do work on one of these windows, we wouldn't say, hey, you've got to put a window back here. How many time? Okay. A little bit about how we choose boundaries. So what we began this project with a survey of a larger area, which is pretty standard in preservation. It's a kind of windshield survey, or for me it was a walking survey, photography, and taking that back to the office and doing research on the buildings to see when they were built, how old they are. And then you get into what is the best of the best, and that's how you kind of define a boundary for a historic district. In general, we try to exclude buildings that are non-contributing. Those are buildings that are new or don't fit the historic context. You try to exclude vacant lots. You try to avoid donut holes and and archipelagos, you know, having little bits here and there. So that's kind of where this district is. We've had people say it's too big. We've had people say it's too small. For people who say it's too small, you know, look at Ukrainian Village. That's been expanded 4 times. So it can always be expanded. We wanted to start with something that we felt was very strong and the best of the best in kind of conveying these aspects of our city's history. So I'll leave it at that and open it up to questions.
That was great.
Thanks.
I guess a few things. One is, I was wondering the historic designation of this area, what your view would be on the impact on economic development. I mean, you've had along the fringes people building taller buildings, which I know are left out.
Yeah.
Positive, negative, can't tell.
Well, part of this historic plan is part of a larger plan, which is called our Innovation District, and that addresses the economic issues. It addresses where we want to see, even in this district, more density. That would be on Lake Street. We're putting together design guidelines that are much more flexible than in any other district in the city to allow we've seen a lot of these commission houses are quite low, to allow these owners to perhaps do an addition on their building that might be visible. This is something that is not allowed elsewhere. This is very, I don't know if you've been out here, but it's very, very hot in terms of real estate speculation now. This has generated a lot of interest, to put it mildly. So we want to be flexible. I mean, look at Armitage Halstead. That landmark district was really contentious. It was commercial buildings. And at the time it was said that this was going to hinder economic development on Armitage. And that was passed in like 2000. 14 years later, I'm not seeing any damage there.
And so the vacant lots that they're developed, they have guidelines then for the...
Right. And also there's quite a few non-contributing buildings here, and they can be demolished or torn down.
And then I assume that the Morgan Station has had a big impact
Morgan
on
Station, absolutely. Huge investment that's paid off.
Thank you.
Is the big cold storage building that's being renovated in your district?
It is, but obviously you can see there it's right at the top. It's non-contributing because what they've done is basically applied a completely new skin, so it doesn't have what we call integrity on the outside. So it's a non-contributing building.
I've read that there's been controversy over the issue of the landmarking of the district. Can you go over who's resistive and their rationale?
You know, there's a lot of different types of property owners here. There are people who have smaller buildings, the commission house type buildings, who see this as limiting what they can do in terms of selling their building and redeveloping their property with a more intensive, taller building. That's really the main issue, is redevelopment. And the problem with that too is that the zoning here, this area was downzoned about 10 years ago. It was asked for by the people out here who own property. It was downzoned basically to keep new residential condo towers from coming in. So that's primarily the issue, and that's an issue that we face all the time in commercial districts.
Thank you for your presentation.
Thank you.
My grandfather built the building at 1101 Fulton.
Is it still there?
And it's still there, and I go to visit it occasionally, as I did when I was a child. So many of the details, however, have been obliterated.
Yeah.
That was a building that had a canopy all the way around and around the corner, and had the big door for the pallets to be wheeled in from the high sidewalk. And I was wondering how you felt about buildings within the district which have had their character totally obliterated.
Yeah, I tried to address that. One of the things that we have to have in a landmark district or a landmark building is physical integrity. And that integrity threshold depends on certain other criteria that you're using for designation. What we think the most important thing about this district is not so much its architecture, but its history. So in that sense, the changes to the building that is important historically and not so much architecturally we can accept those more easily. Now again, anything can be brought back. So if you have a historic photo, I'd like it. And put it in our file. Yeah. It's a very difficult place to park. I think they're going to have some at the former cold storage. They're thinking of doing something outside the district, parking structure. That's a problem. There also is the general intention here is people to use public transport. That was part of the Morgan Station logic, and it's been very successful. But it's true, parking is a problem, and we're working on that.
So I'm just curious about what sort of benchmarking occurs that sort of likens this area to its I don't know, its global peers, for example. It may be Shoreditch in London or other neighborhoods that are exhibiting similar sort of regeneration as this area is. And Chicago tends to be very sentimental. We are not at a loss for historic neighborhoods, but the one thing about this area is that it presents an idea that a new area, a new commercial area, potentially a neighborhood could emerge that breaks the pattern of Chicago neighborhoods. So it's not Wicker Park, not Lakeview, it's not the form factor that people are used to. And to that end, it could accommodate new types of architecture and cutting edge architecture. So a lot of the gripe that I hear about what the city's done here is that it's insensitive to Chicago really becoming world class, and it's sort of once again being a bit too sentimental to its own detriment. So, what benchmarking does occur at the city level to, I look at, for example, the Nobu Hotel, and I look at the design of that and how it's been dumbed down for Chicago to placate this district, and you look at what they're doing in Shoreditch and other areas, and you think, boy, gee, I wish that was in Chicago.
Sure.
So, to what extent is...
Yeah, I was out in Gainesville this summer, and I was impressed. Gainesville is a landmark district in New York City, based on the same types of historic buildings, meatpacking primarily. It's a lot smaller. The additions that are being made on those buildings are very progressive architecture, very cutting edge. And I think we'd like to see that here. We're putting together guidelines that, like I said, are allowing more flexibility for additions to occur. And we're looking at different ways of adding on to a building, but still preserving its character. And they're really pushing the envelope in New York. We did look at other cities. We looked at Cleveland. They had a market district that also included a preservation plan. And that's been very successful. I'm from there, and I can tell you that market district has been extremely successful in turning around a very difficult neighborhood. We looked at Pike's Place in Seattle, another one in South Dakota. So yes, we did look elsewhere. And what we found is if cities were working on a market district, it often included a historic preservation component. And that's what got us thinking, well, here's a market district. Is there a preservation component here? That led to the survey, and that led to the proposed designation.
One more question?
Has there been a growth of art galleries or artists in this area?
That dynamic started in the 80s, and it's continued. Yeah, galleries have started to locate here in the 1980s, and they continue to be present.
So as a last note, there are Illinois Humanities Council surveys outside. If you'd like to fill one out, I'd love to have your responses. And thank you so much to Matt.